come back and read to you chapter 2 so that you can hear exactly the kind of man that Hitler was. Chapter 2 of Mein Kampf, Years of Study and Suffering in Vienna. When my mother died, my fate had already been decided in one respect. During the last months of her illness, I went to Vienna to take the entrance examination for the Academy of Fine Arts. Armed with a bulky packet of sketches, I felt convinced that I should pass the examination quite easily. At the Realschule, I was by far the best student in the drawing class, and since that time I had made more than ordinary progress in the practice of drawing. Therefore I was pleased with myself and was proud and happy at the prospect of what I considered an assured success. But there was one misgiving. It seemed to me that I was better qualified for drawing than for painting, especially in the various branches of architectural drawing. At the same time, my interest in architecture was constantly increasing, and I advanced in this direction at a still more rapid pace after my first visit to Vienna, which lasted 2 weeks. I was not yet 16 years old. I went to the Hof Museum to study the paintings in the art gallery there, but the building itself captured almost all my interest. From early morning until late at night, I spent all my time visiting the various public buildings, and it was the buildings themselves that were always the principal attraction for me. For hours and hours I would stand in wonderment before the opera and the parliament. The whole Ringstrasse had a magic effect upon me, as if it were a scene from the 1001 Nights. And now I was here for the second time in this beautiful city, impatiently waiting to hear the result of the entrance examination, but proudly confident that I had got through. I was so convinced of my success that when the news that I had failed to pass was brought to me, it struck me like a bolt from the skies. Yet the fact was that I had failed. I went to see the rector and asked him to explain the reasons why they refused to accept me as a student in the General School of Painting, which was part of the academy. He said that the sketches which I had brought in with me unquestionably showed that painting was not what I was suited for, but that the same sketches gave clear indications of my aptitude for architectural designing. Therefore, the School of Painting did not come into question for me, but rather the School of Architecture, which also formed part of the academy. At first, it was impossible to understand how this could be so, seeing that I had never been to a school for architecture and had never received any instruction in architectural designing. When I left the Hansen Palace on the Schiller Platz, I was quite crestfallen. I felt out of sorts with myself for the first time in my young life, for what I had heard about my capabilities now appeared to me as a lightning flash which clearly revealed a dualism under which I had been suffering for a long time. But hitherto I could give no clear account whatsoever of the why and wherefore. Within a few days, I myself also knew that I ought to become an architect, but of course the way was very difficult. I was now forced bitterly to rue my former conduct in neglecting and despising certain subjects at the Realschule. Before taking up the courses at the School of Architecture in the Academy, it was necessary to attend the Technical Building School, but a necessary qualification for entrance into this school was a leaving certificate from the middle school, and this I simply did not have. According to the human measure of things, my dream of following an artistic calling seemed beyond the limits of possibility. After the death of my mother, I came to Vienna for the 3rd time. This visit was destined to last several years. Since I had been back there, I had recovered my old calm and resoluteness. The former self-assurance had come back, and I had my eyes steadily fixed on the goal. I would be an architect. Obstacles are placed across our path in life, not to be boggled at, but to be surmounted. And I was fully determined to surmount these obstacles, having the picture of my father constantly before my mind, who had raised himself by his own efforts to the position of a civil servant, though he was the poor son of a village shoemaker. I had a better start, and the possibilities of struggling through were better. At that time, my lot in life seemed to me a harsh one, but today I see in it the wise workings of Providence. The goddess of fate clutched me in her hands and often threatened to smash me, but the will grew stronger as the obstacles increased, and finally the will triumphed. I am thankful for that period of my life because it hardened me and enabled me to be as tough as I now am. And I am even more thankful because I appreciate the fact that I was thus saved from the emptiness of a life of ease, and that a mother's darling was taken from tender arms and handed over to adversity as to a new mother. Though I then rebelled against it as too hard a fate, I am grateful that I was thrown into a world of misery and poverty, and thus came to know the people for whom I was afterwards to fight. It was during this period that my eyes were opened to two perils, the names of which I scarcely knew hitherto, and had no notion whatsoever of their terrible significance for the existence of the German people. These two perils were Marxism and Judaism. For many people, the name of Vienna signifies innocent jollity, a festive place for happy mortals. For me, alas, it is a living memory of the saddest period in my life. Even today, the mention of that city arouses only gloomy thoughts in my mind. 5 years of poverty in that Phaeacian town, 5 years in which, first as a casual labourer and then as a painter of little trifles, I had to earn my daily bread. And a meagre morsel indeed it was, not even sufficient to still the hunger which I constantly felt. That hunger was the faithful guardian which left me, but took part in everything, which never left me, but took part in everything I did. Every book that I bought meant renewed hunger, and every visit I paid to the opera meant the intrusion of that inalienable companion during the following days. I was always struggling with my unsympathetic friend, and yet during that time I learned more than I had ever learned before. Outside my architectural studies and rare visits to the opera, for which I had to deny myself food, I had no other pleasure in life except my books. I read a great deal then, and I pondered deeply over what I read. All the free time after work was devoted exclusively to study. Thus, within a few years, I was able to acquire a stock of knowledge which I find useful even today. But more than that, during those years, a view of life and a definite outlook on the world took shape in my mind. These became the granite basis of my conduct at that time. Since then, I have extended that foundation only very little, and I have changed nothing in it. On the contrary, I am firmly convinced today that, generally speaking, it is in youth that men lay the essential groundwork of their creative thought, wherever that creative thought exists. I make a distinction between the wisdom of age, which can only arise from the greater profundity and foresight that are based on the experiences of a long life, and the creative genius of youth, which blossoms out in thought and ideas with inexhaustible fertility, without being able to put these into practice immediately because of their very superabundance. These furnish the building materials and plans for the future, and it is from them that age takes the stones and builds the edifice, unless the so-called wisdom of the years may have smothered the creative genius of youth. The life which I had hitherto led at home with my parents differed in little or nothing from that of all the others. I looked forward without apprehension to the morrow, and there was no such thing as a social problem to be faced. Those among whom I passed my young days belonged to the small bourgeois class. Therefore, it was a world that had very little contact with the world of genuine manual labourers. For though at first this may appear astonishing, the ditch which separates that class, which is by no means economically well off, from the manual labouring class is often deeper than people think. The reason for this division, which we may almost call enmity, lies in the fear that dominates a social group which has only just risen above the level of the manual labourer, a fear lest it may fall back into its old condition, or at least be classed with the labourers. Moreover, there is something repulsive in remembering the cultural indigence of that lower class and their rough manners with one another. so that people who are only on the first rung of the social ladder find it unbearable to be forced to have any contact with the cultural level and standard of living out of which they have passed. And so it happens that very often those who belong to what can really be called the upper classes find it much easier than do the upstarts to descend to and intermingle with their fellow beings on the lowest social level. For by the word upstart, I mean everyone who has raised himself through his own efforts to a social level higher than that to which he formerly belonged. In the case of such a person, the hard struggle through which he passes often destroys his normal human sympathy. His own fight for existence kills his sensibility for the misery of those who have been left behind. From this point of view, fate had been kind to me. Circumstances forced me to return to that world of poverty and economic insecurity above which my father had raised himself in his early days, and thus the blinkers of a narrow, petite, bourgeois education were torn from my eyes. Now, for the first time, I learned to know men, and I learned to distinguish between empty appearances or brutal manners and the real inner nature of the people who outwardly appeared thus. At the beginning of the century, Vienna had taken rank among those cities where social conditions are iniquitous. Dazzling riches and loathsome destitution were intermingled in violent contrast. In the centre and in the inner city, one felt the pulse beat of an empire which had a population of 52 millions, with all the perilous charm of a state made up of multiple nationalities. The dazzling splendour of the court acted like a magnet on the wealth and intelligence of the whole empire, and this attraction was further strengthened by the dynastic policy of the Habsburg monarchy in centralising everything in itself and for itself. This centralising policy was necessary in order to hold together that hodgepodge of heterogeneous nationalities, but the result of it was an extraordinary concentration of higher officials in the city, which was at one and at the same time the metropolis and imperial residence. But Vienna was not merely the political and intellectual centre of the Danubian monarchy, it was also the commercial centre. Besides the horde of military officers of high rank, state officials, artists and scientists, there was still the vaster horde of workers. Abject poverty confronted the wealth of the aristocracy and the merchant class face to face. Thousands of unemployed loitered in front of the palaces on the Ringstrasse, and below that, via triumphalis of the old Austria, the homeless huddled together in the murk and filth of the canals. There was hardly any other German city in which the social problem could be studied better than in Vienna. But here I must utter a warning against the illusion that this problem can be studied from above downwards. The man who has never been in the clutches of that crushing viper can never know what its poison is. An attempt to study it in any other way will result only in superficial talk and sentimental delusions. Both are harmful. The first because it can never go to the root of the question, the second because it evades the question entirely. I do not know which is the more nefarious, to ignore social distress, as do the majority of those who have been favoured by fortune and those who have risen in the social scale through their own routine labour, or the equally supercilious and often tactless but always genteel condescension displayed by people who make a fad of being charitable and who plume themselves on sympathising with the people. Of course, such persons sin more than they can imagine from a lack of instinctive understanding, and thus they are astonished to find that the social conscience on which they pride themselves never produces any results, but often causes their good intentions to be resented, and then they talk of the ingratitude of the people. Such persons are slow to learn that here there is no place for merely social activities and that there can be no expectation of gratitude. For in this connection there is no question at all of distributing favours, but essentially a matter of retributive justice. I was protected against the temptation to study the social question in the way just mentioned, for the simple reason that I was forced to live in the midst of poverty-stricken people. Therefore, it was not a question of studying the problem objectively, but rather one of testing its effects on myself. Though the rabbit came through the ordeal of the experiment, this must not be taken as evidence of its harmlessness. When I try today to recall the succession of impressions received during that time, I find that I can do so only with approximate completeness. Here I shall describe only the more essential impressions and those which personally affected me and often staggered me, and I shall mention the few lessons that I learned from this experience. At that time, it was for the most part not very difficult to find work because I had to seek work not as a skilled tradesman, but as a so-called extra hand ready to take any job that turned up by chance, just for the sake of earning my daily bread. Thus I found myself in the same situation as all those emigrants who shake the dust of Europe from their feet, with the cast iron determination to lay the foundations of a new existence in the new world and acquire for themselves a new home. Liberated from all the paralysing prejudices of class and calling, environment and tradition, they enter any service that opens its door to them, accepting any work that comes their way. Filled more and more with the idea that honest work never disgraced anybody, no matter what kind it may be. And so I was resolved to set both feet in what was for me a new world and push forward on my own road. I soon found out that there was some kind of work always to be got, but I also learned that it could be just as quickly and easily lost. The uncertainty of being able to earn a regular daily livelihood soon appeared to me as the gloomiest feature in this new life that I had entered. Although the skilled worker was not so frequently thrown idle on the streets as the unskilled worker, yet the former was by no means protected against the same fate, because though he may not have to face hunger as a result of unemployment due to the lack of demand in the labour market, the lockout and the strike deprived the skilled worker of the chance to earn his bread. Here the element of uncertainty in steadily earning one's daily bread was the bitterest feature of the whole social economic system itself. The country lad who migrates to the big city feels attracted by what has been described as easy work, which it may be in reality, and few working hours. He is especially entranced by the magic glimmer spread over the big cities. Accustomed in the country to earn a steady wage, he has been taught not to quit his former post until a new one is at least in sight. As there is a great scarcity of agricultural labour, the probability of long unemployment in the country has been very small. It is a mistake to presume that the lad who leaves the countryside for the town is not made of such sound material as those who remain at home to work on the land. On the contrary, experience shows that it is the more healthy and more vigorous that emigrate, and not the reverse. Among these emigrants, I include not merely those who emigrate to America, but also the servant boy in the country who decides to leave his native village and migrate to the big city, where he will be a stranger. He is ready to take the risk of an uncertain fate. In most cases, he comes to town with a little money in his pocket, and for the first few days he is not discouraged if he should not have the good fortune to find work. But if he finds a job and then loses it in a little while, the case is much worse. To find work anew, especially in winter, is often difficult and indeed sometimes impossible. For the first few weeks, life is still bearable. He receives his out-of-work money from his trade union and is thus enabled to carry on. But when the last of his own money is gone and his trade union ceases to pay out because of the prolonged unemployment, then comes the real distress. He now loiters about and is hungry. Often he pawns or sells the last of his belongings. His clothes begin to get shabby, and with the increasing poverty of his outward appearance, he descends to a lower social level and mixes up with the class of human beings through whom his mind is now poisoned, in addition to his physical misery. Then he has nowhere to sleep, and if that happens in winter, which is very often the case, he is in dire distress. Finally, he gets work. But the old story repeats itself. A second time the same thing happens, then a third time, and now it is probably much worse. Little by little he becomes indifferent to his everlasting insecurity. Finally he grows used to the repetition. Thus even a man who is normally of industrious habits grows careless in his whole attitude towards life, and gradually becomes an instrument in the hands of unscrupulous people who exploit him for the sake of their own ignoble aims. He has been so often thrown out of employment through no fault of his own that he is now more or less indifferent whether the strike in which he takes part be for the purpose of securing his economic rights or be aimed at the destruction of the state, the whole social order and even civilization itself. Though the idea of going on strike may not be to his natural liking, yet he joins it out of sheer indifference. I saw this process exemplified before my eyes in thousands of cases, and the longer I observed it, in the greater became my dislike for that mammoth city which greedily attracts men to its bosom in order to break them mercilessly in the end. When they came, they still felt themselves in communion with their own people at home. If they remained, that tie was broken. I was thrown about so much in the life of the metropolis that I experienced the workings of this fate in my own person and felt the effects of it in my own soul. One thing stood out clearly before my eyes. It was the sudden changes from work to idleness and vice versa, so that the constant fluctuations thus caused by earnings and expenditure finally destroyed the sense of thrift for many people and also the habit of regulating expenditure in an intelligent way. The body appeared to grow accustomed to the vicissitudes of food and hunger, eating heartily in good times and going hungry in bad. Indeed, hunger shatters all plans for rationing expenditure on a regular scale in better times when employment is again found. The reason for this is that the deprivations which the unemployed worker has to endure must be compensated for psychologically by a persistent mental mirage in which he imagines himself eating heartily once again. And this dream develops into such a longing that it turns into a morbid impulse to cast off all self-restraint when work and wages turns up again. Therefore, the moment work is found anew, he forgets to regulate the expenditure of his earnings, but spends them to the full without thinking of tomorrow. This leads to confusion in the little weekly housekeeping budget, because the expenditure is not rationally planned. When the phenomenon which I have mentioned first happens, the earnings will last perhaps for 5 days instead of 7. On subsequent occasions, they will last only for 3. As the habit recurs, the earnings will last scarcely for a day, and finally they will disappear in one night of feasting. Often there are wife and children at home, and in many cases it happens that these become infected by such a way of living, especially if the husband is good to them and wants to do the best he can for them and loves them in his own way and according to his own lights. Then the week's earnings are spent in common at home within 2 or 3 days. The family eat and drink together as long as the money lasts, and at the end of the week they hunger together. Then the wife wanders about furtively in the neighbourhood, borrows a little and runs up small debts with the shopkeepers in an effort to pull through the lean days towards the end of the week. They sit down together to the midday meal with only meagre fare on the table and often nothing to eat. They wait for the coming payday, talking of it and making plans, and while they are thus hungry, they dream of the plenty that is to come. And so the little children become acquainted with misery in their early years. But the evil culminates when the husband goes his own way from the beginning of the week, and the wife protests, simply out of love for the children. Then there are quarrels and bad feeling, and the husband takes to drink according as he becomes estranged from his wife. He now becomes drunk every Saturday, fighting for her own existence and that of the children. The wife has to hound him along the road from the factory to the tavern in order to get a few shillings from him on payday. Then when he finally comes home, maybe on the Sunday or the Monday, having parted with his last shillings and pence, pitiable scenes follow, scenes that cry out for God's mercy. I have had actual experience of this in hundreds of cases. At first I was disgusted and indignant, but later on I came to recognise the whole tragedy of their misfortune and to understand the profound causes of it. They were the unhappy victims of evil circumstances. Housing conditions were very bad at that time. The Vienna manual labourers lived in surroundings of appalling misery. I shudder even today when I think of the woeful dens in which people dwelt, the night shelters and the slums, and all the tenebrous tentacles of ordure, loathsome filth and wickedness. What will happen one day when hordes of emancipated slaves come forth from these dens of misery to swoop down on their unsuspecting fellow men? For this other world does not think about such a possibility. They have allowed these things to go on without caring, and even without suspecting, in their total lack of instinctive understanding, that sooner or later destiny will take its vengeance, unless it will have been appeased in time. Today I fervently thank Providence for having sent me to such a school. There I could not refuse to take an interest in matters that did not please me. This school soon taught me a profound lesson. In order not to despair completely of the people among whom I lived, I had to set on one side the outward appearance of their lives, and on the other the reasons why they had developed in that way. Then I could hear everything without discouragement, for those who emerged from all this misfortune and misery, from this filth and outward degradation, were not human beings as such, but rather lamentable results of lamentable laws. In my own life, similar hardships prevented me from giving way to a pitying sentimentality at the sight of these degraded products which had finally resulted from the pressure of circumstances. No, the sentimental attitude would be the wrong one to adopt. Even in those days I already saw that there was a twofold method by which alone it would be possible to bring about an amelioration of these conditions. This method is, first, to create better fundamental conditions of social development by establishing a profound feeling for social responsibilities among the public. Second, to combine this feeling for social responsibilities with a ruthless determination to prune away all excrescences which are incapable of being improved. Just as nature concentrates its greatest attention not to the maintenance of what already exists, but on the selective breeding of offspring in order to carry on the species, so in human life also it is less a matter of artificially improving the existing generation, which, owing to human characteristics, is impossible in 99 cases out of 100, and more a matter of securing from the very start a better road for future development. During my struggle for existence in Vienna, I perceived very clearly that the aim of all social activity must never be merely charitable relief, which is ridiculous and useless, but it must rather be a means to find a way of eliminating the fundamental deficiencies in our economic and cultural life, deficiencies which necessarily bring about the degradation of the individual, or at least lead him towards such degradation. The difficulty of employing every means, even the most drastic, to eradicate the hostility prevailing among the working classes towards the state is largely due to an attitude of uncertainty in deciding upon the inner motives and causes of this contemporary phenomenon. The grounds of this uncertainty are to be found exclusively in the sense of guilt which each individual feels for having permitted this tragedy of degradation. For that feeling paralyses every effort at making a serious and firm decision to act. and thus because the people whom it concerns are vacillating, they are timid and half-hearted in putting into effect even the measures which are indispensable for self-preservation. When the individual is no longer burdened with his own consciousness of blame in this regard, then and only then will he have that inner tranquility and outer force to cut off drastically and ruthlessly all the parasite growth and root out the weeds. But because the Austrian state had almost no sense of social rights or social legislation, its inability to abolish those evil excrescences was manifest. I do not know what it was that appalled me most at that time. The economic misery of those who were then my companions, their crude customs and morals, or the low level of their intellectual culture. How often our bourgeoisie rises up in moral indignation on hearing from the mouth of some pitiable tramp that it is all the same to him whether he be a German or not, and that he will find himself at home wherever he can get enough to keep body and soul together. They protest sternly against such a lack of national pride and strongly express their horror at such sentiments. But how many people really ask themselves why it is that their own sentiments are better? How many of them understand that their national pride in being members of so favoured a nation arises from the innumerable succession of instances they have encountered which remind them of the greatness of the fatherland and the nation in all spheres of artistic and cultural life? How many of them realise that pride in the fatherland is largely dependent on knowledge of its greatness in all of those spheres? Do our bourgeois circle ever think that a ridiculously meagre share the people have in that knowledge, which is a necessary prerequisite for the feeling of pride in one's fatherland? I'm going to let this one go up so I can get my breath back and catch my voice. But this is Adolf Hitler you are listening to. I don't hear a monster. I hear a man filled with compassion, an intelligent man, able to articulate and get to the root of everything that he experiences and studies out of a profound love for his fellow human beings. I'll be back.